The history of the German Flak is, in essence, the history of a silent sacrifice. From the first shots in 1939 until the last days in the ruins of Berlin, its crews lived condemned to a predictable fate, to always fight exposed, visible from the sky, and to fall one after another with no real possibility of relief. Their lives were consumed in endless shifts, between the smoke of gunpowder and the roar of cannons that seemed to devour both shells and men. For the civilian population, the Flak was a symbol of resistance. The concrete towers, the beams of light in the night, and the flashes on the horizon were interpreted as signs that Germany could still defend itself. But behind that heroic image, the gunners suffered hunger, cold, exhaustion, and constant fear. Each victory was fleeting. Each bomber shot down cost dozens of lives. On the Eastern Front, their cannons became executioners of Soviet tanks, but also fixed targets that were mercilessly crushed. In the cities, they resisted waves of bombs that destroyed entire neighborhoods. In the final days, they were manned by teenagers and old men of the Volkssturm, turned into improvised soldiers who could barely lift the shells they loaded. The result was devastating. It is estimated that nearly 80% of Flak crews perished during the war. They did not die in glorious advances nor in epic charges, but in static posts, surrounded by smoke and rubble, fulfilling a duty they knew was impossible. Their story is that of men and boys who, without shelter or rest, faced a sky turned into an absolute enemy. A life of fatigue, suffering, and repeated death that made the Flak the most tragic face of the German defense. A human wall raised against the inevitable. The beginning improvised urban defense, 1939 to 1940. When the Second World War broke out, the German anti-aircraft system was not yet the colossal machinery that would later be known as the Flak. Its origin was marked by improvisations, technical limitations inherited from the First World War, and at the same time by the obsession of Hitler and Goering with preventing the civilian population of the Reich from suffering again what they had seen in 1914 to 1918. Since 1933, the regime had invested enormous resources in anti-aircraft guns and in a doctrine that conceived the defense of the airspace as a task shared between fighters and ground artillery. However, when the war began in September of 1939, that doctrine faced a very different reality. The German cities were defended by batteries placed in squares, parks, or rooftops with little more than sand parapets without solid shelters and with crews who still did not know the magnitude of the coming air offensive. In that first year, the function of the Flak was less to destroy planes than to condition their attacks. The figures of consumption show it. Tens of thousands of 88mm shells were needed to bring down a single bomber. Nevertheless, as the doctrinal manuals of 1935 pointed out, the primary objective was not so much to shoot down aircraft as to force them to fly higher and with less accuracy. Every 5,000 feet of additional altitude reduced the effectiveness of the bombs dropped by half, and that meant that more shells fired into the sky translated into less steel falling accurately on factories and working-class neighborhoods. The effectiveness of the Flak was measured not only in kills, but in distorting the enemy attack, breaking formations, and provoking evasive maneuvers. But that technical effectiveness implied lethal exposure. The anti-aircraft pieces were outdoors, immobile, and became priority targets for enemy aviation. Already in 1939, during the first British attacks against German ports, it was seen that the cannons of Wilhelmshaven or Brunsbüttel could bring down some planes, but at the cost of suffering heavy losses in men and material. The defense was static and lacked adequate armor. Unlike a tank or a fighter, the servants of an 88 or a 37mm gun fought standing under the rain of shrapnel with the entire body exposed. The result was that casualties began to accumulate from the very beginning, and with them the lesson that the Flak would be the most punished branch of the entire Luftwaffe. The development of the air war in 1940 confirmed these initial lessons. The campaign in the West and shortly after the Battle of Britain consolidated the need to multiply the batteries in all German cities. The British had learned in 1917 the psychological impact of the bombings of Gotha and Zeppelins, and now applied those lessons with multiplied power. Berlin was hit for the first time in August of 1940. More than 100 planes entered the capital of the Reich, and although bomber losses were minimal, the moral impact on Hitler was enormous. Goering had promised that no enemy plane would reach the Ruhr region and that they could call him Meyer if that happened. The reality was different. The bombers passed, and the only barriers were the beams of light and the cannons that fired hundreds of shells without being able to completely stop the tide. The first statistics showed the harshness of the effort. In 1939, Germany had 657 heavy batteries, 560 light ones, and 188 of searchlights. It was a considerable number, but insufficient against the pace of the Allied offensive. To cover a single-night raid of the RAF, tens of thousands of shells were fired that barely managed to bring down a few planes. However, the figures were misleading. More important than the kills was the cumulative damage. Each bomber hit by shrapnel, even if it managed to return to its base, could be rendered useless for weeks or forced into an emergency landing in England. The enemy knew it, and that is why the testimonies of air gunners agreed. The most feared thing was not the fighters, but crossing the curtain of black and red fire that exploded in the German sky. The improvisation of those first years was also reflected in the composition of the crews. In 1940, there were already 500,000 men assigned to the Flak, and the number would grow without stopping. To maintain those figures, from very early on, young men and workers mobilized from factories without prior experience were incorporated. Their training was brief and their exposure immediate. Unlike fighter pilots, who accumulated flight hours before entering combat, an anti-aircraft gun assistant could be serving ammunition in Hamburg or Essen just weeks after being recruited. The human cost was extremely high. For each enemy plane shot down, dozens of servants died or were mutilated by bombs and bursts. The other great factor of mortality was the nature of the work itself. Each shot of an 88mm gun generated brutal recoil and a cloud of smoke that immediately revealed the position. For Allied bombers, locating the batteries was simple. It was enough to follow the trace of the flashes and concentrate the discharge on them. That is why often the cannons fired only brief bursts and then tried to relocate the piece, but in large cities where they were cemented on concrete bases, that mobility was impossible. There the order was to resist until the end, with the predictable result of enormous losses among the crews. The idea of improvised urban defense reached its maximum expression in the so-called Flaktürme of Berlin, Hamburg and Vienna, projected from 1940 onward. These reinforced concrete towers housed heavy guns and offered, for the first time, real protection to the crews. But they were exceptions. Most cities had guns placed in vacant lots or rooftops without armor. In the first years of war, the losses were so severe that it was estimated that more than 60% of the gunners of the most exposed positions did not survive a year of service. The figure would increase as the intensity of the bombings grew. In strategic terms, the Flak of 1939 to 1940 played a crucial role. It did not stop the RAF, but it conditioned its operations. The British failure in daylight attacks against Wilhelmshaven and Brunsbüttel, where 17 of 36 Wellingtons were shot down in December of 1939, forced a change of tactic and a switch to night bombings. Anti-aircraft artillery, even with its low kill rate, had proved too lethal for the tactic of the self-sufficient daylight bomber in that initial stage. Thus, unintentionally, the German guns redrew the strategic map of the air war, forcing the enemy to modify its doctrine. That first point of the history of the Flak shows clearly the paradox that would accompany these units until 1945. They were indispensable for the defense of the Reich, but their crews were condemned to horrifying mortality rates. The initial improvisation, the constant exposure, and the absence of solid protection explain why already in 1940 the anti-aircraft gunners were among the most punished men of the Reich, and why at the end of the war it would be said that more than 80% of those who served in those pieces did not survive the aerial storm that struck Germany. The dual role, sky and earth. From its first shots, the German Flak showed that it was not a weapon destined only for the sky. The 88mm cannon, born to challenge high-altitude bombers, very soon found a different stage: the plain, the desert, and the frozen fields of the east. There, its unmistakable silhouette rose not only as air defense, but as executioner of tanks, fortifications, and motorized columns. That double nature, anti-aircraft cannon and ground support weapon, ended up becoming a mark of German warfare, although the price in lives of its servers multiplied as they were exposed on two fire fronts. The Campaign of France in 1940 was the first large-scale demonstration. The German army discovered that the heavy British and French armoured vehicles resisted the impacts of conventional artillery. The 37mm pieces that accompanied the panzer divisions proved powerless against tanks such as the Matilda II. In contrast, the 8.8cm Flak 18 and 36 pierced armour at considerable distances. Those cannons, placed at the edge of the roads, supported by ammunition trucks and camouflaged behind hedges or hills, stopped attacks that could have broken the offensive. From that moment, the weapon was considered by the soldiers themselves as the last word, when everything else failed. The enemy feared it. A dry roar, a flash, and a tank burned in seconds. The African desert amplified that reputation. Rommel depended on the batteries of 88mm to stop the British offensives. Under the relentless sun, the cannons were nailed into the sand and covered with camouflage nets. When the Crusaders or the Grants advanced confidently, they were received by a volley of fire that pierced turrets and chassis as if they were paper. The anti-aircraft weapon had become the most effective of the available anti-tank pieces, and its use on land became normalized. However, each shot revealed the position and attracted artillery and fighter bombers. The losses in North Africa were enormous. The gunners were exposed in the middle of the desert without shelters, forced to remain next to a piece that could not move quickly. The Eastern Front raised the dual role to an industrial scale. When Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet armoured columns surprised many German commanders. Tanks such as the T-34 or the KV-1 were virtually invulnerable to standard anti-tank cannons. Again, the 88 was the answer. Placed in advanced batteries at railway junctions, at the entrances of cities, or even improvised in ambushes, it was the only weapon capable of splitting in two the enemy armour. There, the Flak stopped being simply defense of the sky. It became the axis of the survival of the German divisions. Soviet testimonies spoke of the black cannon as the most fearsome obstacle on the battlefield, but that usefulness had a terrible cost. The Flak servers on the ground had to operate in the open sky without armoured turrets to protect them. Each confrontation with tanks was a race against time. Aiming, calculating the distance, firing before the Soviet formation reached the range of their cannons or launched an infantry assault. At Kursk, in the summer of 1943, hundreds of pieces of 88 and 105mm were emplaced to reinforce the defensive lines. They fulfilled their task, destroying waves of armoured vehicles, but many of those positions were literally overrun by the Soviet tide. The crews, surrounded and with no possibility of retreat, were annihilated in their emplacements. The same logic was applied on other fronts. In Italy, the anti-aircraft cannons were used against Allied positions entrenched in mountains and towns. The firepower, designed to pierce bomber fuselages, was devastating against walls and fortifications. The same happened in the defensive battles of Germany starting in 1944. The flak cannons were employed against American armored columns that tried to break towards the Rhine. The weapon fulfilled two roles at once, and in both it was feared. That strategic flexibility made the flak an indispensable resource, but condemned its crews to one of the highest casualty rates of the entire war. They were not only the target of bombers and fighter bombers when they fired towards the sky, they also became priority objectives of tanks and artillery when they acted on the ground. The testimonies collected by historians such as Westermann show that few gunners survived more than 1 year of active service. Replacements were constant, and each new crew learned quickly that serving an anti-aircraft cannon was in reality accepting a destiny of combat without respite. The dual character of the flak revealed, moreover, the German logic of total war. The Luftwaffe could not sustain by itself the defense of the Reich. It needed its ground artillery to multiply functions, firing both against the sky and against the columns of steel that burst in from all fronts. The flak was, at the same time, the shield and the spear. It covered the cities from bombardment, but it was also the decisive piece to stop an armored advance. That demand of fighting in 2 dimensions explains both its fame and its tragedy. The cannons, from the light ones of 20mm to the heavy ones of 128mm, became the image of total combat. They fired against planes, against tanks, against troops. They were ubiquitous on every front, and each shot meant more chances of being detected, more danger for their servers. Thus, the German Flak was not only an anti-aircraft force, but a versatile artillery, vital and deadly at the same time. A force that lived between two worlds, with the certainty that in either of them death lurked nearby. The physical and psychological wear of the flak gunners. The life of a flak gunner was not measured in months nor in campaigns, but in days that were consumed like embers in the storm. The body deteriorated slowly, not only from the visible wounds of shrapnel, but from the accumulation of fatigue, cold, and privations that corroded the muscles, the nerves, and the mind. From the moment a man or a boy was assigned to a battery, his existence was reduced to an exhausting cycle. Vigilance, firing, waiting, fear. There was no pause because the air war never rested. The physical wear began with the work itself. Each shell of 88mm was a block of steel and explosive that had to be loaded manually. Hundreds of them passed through the hands of the servers in a single day of combat. The recoil of the cannon shook the bones and forced the gunners to maintain tense postures with arched backs and hardened arms. After weeks, the bodies were covered with bruises, cuts, and calluses, the nails black from gunpowder, the eyes irritated by smoke, the lungs full of metallic dust. The gunpowder stuck to the skin like a second layer, difficult to remove even after the scarce washings. But the true wear was not limited to the muscles. The Russian cold infiltrated down to the bones and gnawed at resistance. In winter, the gunners spent hours motionless, with frozen hands on the aiming crank or holding icy shells that tore the skin at contact. Gloves were a luxury and often broke after a few weeks of use. Some men described how, after several hours on guard, their feet became numb, and when removing their boots appeared bloody blisters or purple toes from the onset of gangrene. In summer, the heat was equally relentless. The metal of the cannons burned the palms, and the uniforms soaked in sweat became a damp prison. To all this was added fatigue. Air raid alarms did not respect shifts nor rests. They could sound at dawn after a 12-hour guard. The men ran half asleep to their positions, with reddened eyes and clumsy movements. The body had no time to recover. Many gunners lived in a state of permanent drowsiness, dragging their feet, nodding while waiting for the next wave. In those conditions, mistakes were fatal. A badly placed shell, a misheard order, a shot delayed by seconds could mean the destruction of the battery. The psychological deterioration was even more devastating. The flak soldier lived exposed, without solid shelters. Each flash of his cannon revealed him and attracted enemy bombs. That certainty generated a state of permanent anguish. One of the gunners wrote that the most terrible moment was not firing, but waiting for the counterattack, knowing that in seconds he could die crushed by a bomb of 250 kilos. That weight undermined the most resistant minds. The stomach shrunk, the heart beating in the throat, the breath held. The repetition of danger generated a strange phenomenon, a mixture of apathy and extreme nervousness. Some gunners seemed to get used to it, fired with mechanical movements without showing emotion. Others, on the other hand, developed nervous tics, constant blinking, trembling hands, fits of laughter or crying at the least expected moments. The diagnosis of the time called it nervous exhaustion, but it was, in reality, what we now recognize as combat trauma. The constant noise was another torture. The cannons thundered for hours. Each shot shook the eardrums and left a persistent ringing. Many men were left deaf for life. Others suffered chronic vertigo. Sometimes after a night attack, they could not sleep because they continued to hear imaginary explosions, echoes that resounded in the mind even though the sky was clear. The nearby death was the daily routine. The gunners lived surrounded by the corpses of comrades. A battery could lose in one night half of its crew. The replacements arrived the next day, boys with beardless faces who joined a piece still stained with fresh blood. There were no ceremonies nor farewells. The bodies were removed in haste, wrapped in blankets, and the routine continued. Mourning was suspended because survival demanded concentrating on the next attack. That survival mechanism, continuing to work without looking back, ended up eroding sensitivity. Death became normal, and that normality was in itself an unbearable weight for the spirit. Hunger completed the circle. The rations were scarce and monotonous: black bread, watery soup, barley coffee. The gunners needed calories to sustain the physical effort, but rarely obtained them. The extreme thinness, the sunken faces, the permanent dark circles were part of the landscape. Some men confessed that they dreamed more of food than of women or peace. Fresh bread, meat, beer. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, caused minor wounds to become infected and colds to turn into lethal pneumonias. The psychological weight of duty was also unbearable. The propaganda called them the guardians of the Reich, but in reality they knew they were cannon fodder. The Allied bombers arrived by thousands, and they were barely a few points of fire in the immensity of the sky. A veteran recounted that each time he saw the formations of B-17 approaching, he felt that he was facing an indestructible wall. "We fired, but it was like throwing stones against a storm," he wrote. That feeling of uselessness corroded morale. Firing without ceasing and seeing that the planes kept advancing created a mixture of frustration and hopelessness. Comradeship was perhaps the only relief. The men shared cigarettes, letters, memories. In the middle of hell, friendship became a lifeline. Many said that the only thing that kept them standing was not abandoning the comrade on the right. That loyalty, however, also multiplied the pain. When a comrade fell, the emotional wound was deeper than any shrapnel. Some gunners collapsed when losing a close friend. Others simply hardened more, hiding sadness under a shell of silence. In the end, the total wear was unavoidable. Bodies broken by fatigue, minds fractured by constant fear, souls extinguished by the routine of death. The life of a Flak soldier was pure suffering, an existence in which each day a battle was fought not only against the enemy in the air, but against one's own despair. And even so, they remained at their posts, firing towards a sky that seemed infinite, because not doing so meant surrendering to the certainty of destruction. The weight of artillery over the cities, strategic bombings, and the tragedy of the German Flak. When the German sky began to be systematically crossed by Allied formations, the Flak, already turned into the backbone of urban defense, found itself established as never before against a ruthless test. The cities of the Reich, once symbols of pride and industrial progress, were transformed into fortresses overwhelmed by cannons and smoke, where each explosion over the rooftops was also a cry of agony of those who remained on solid ground. In that stage, demolished buildings replaced facades, and anti-aircraft artillery was counted by the thousands. Every night, raid absorbed tens of thousands of shells fired into the sky with the hope of fragmenting bomber formations, even if they were only desperate and fragmentary blows. The psychological impact was brutal. Among the gunners it was said that the flak was so dense that one could walk on it, and that those black and reddish clouds of shrapnel seemed to swallow the very air. One of the most terrifying stories came from a battery placed in the suburbs of an industrial city. During a particularly fierce attack, an 88mm gun burst with an unbearable thunder when hitting a bomber, but that victory came with a price. All the members of the crew were so devastated by shrapnel, rubble, and the brutal recoil of the cannon that only one soldier managed to articulate a sentence: "I no longer know if we are alive or dead." In another case near the Ruhr, a bomber returned with more than 200 holes in the fuselage, product of anti-aircraft fire, but even that carnage caused only partial damage. It returned to base thanks to desperate efforts of the pilots, while below, the gunners who had grazed it were reported missing. The deployment of the flak was exacerbated in that period. Entire divisions, hundreds of light and heavy cannons, searchlights, rudimentary radars were grouped around industrial hubs, large urban centers, and armament factories. It was not uncommon for a flak battery to be composed of teenagers recruited from schools, workers mobilized in urgency, and even prisoners released under oath. One of those units, deployed in a great city, could hear from the afternoon how the engines of the bombers flared and the sirens announced their arrival. For endless hours the city lit up with flashes and shell explosions, and the battery lost, in only one night, more than 70% of its crew. Those who survived spoke of a prolonged nightmare, seeing comrades fall to fragmentation, burns, and shrapnel that opened fissures in the earth. Further west, within smoking ruins, an improvised crew assembled an 88, a Flak 36, among the debris of destroyed buildings. With automatic movements and haste, those men, almost children, loaded shell after shell while the bombers dived down. They launched brief salvos, hoping to confuse the enemy calculations, and then tried to reorganize while a nearby explosion shook their senses. One of them, after firing, confessed to stepping back a few steps with his heart pounding like a hammer, fearing that the ground would split beneath his feet. That night, more than half of his comrades lay in the rubble, victims of shrapnel or of the collapse of a building that, when falling, took everything in its path: cannon, ammunition, and men. At times, the Flak even became a moral support for the population. The whistling and fall of shells were brutal noises, but they were also a promise of resistance. However, that symbolic defense ended up being a collective sacrifice. The crews were visible from the sky, static, and each explosion in the air was a signal for the bombers where to aim. On the home fronts, in a great city pulverized by waves of Lancasters and fortresses, it is said that a gunner, struck by a shrapnel fracture, continued pressing the trigger for a few seconds before falling, sending one last flash of fire into the darkness. When his comrades returned, they found him motionless, the cannon still hot, as if he had tried to hold up the sky with his own life. How much did it cost to bring down a single Allied plane at that time? Tens of thousands of shells. But what was not said so much was what it cost to sustain each cannon. Dozens of crew members, young and old, with faces covered in soot and fear, who never saw the dawn. For each bomber hit, there were dozens of men fallen in improvised trenches. The Flak had been transformed into a human shield embedded beneath the flaming skies. This period showed the tragic revolution of urban defense in 1942 and 1943. The center and south of Germany lived total war as never before. The batteries of anti-aircraft guns were deployed at every key point: factories, power plants, railway junctions. Mixed units were integrated, light cannons on rooftops, heavy ones in squares reinforced with sandbags, and searchlights rotating endlessly across terrified skies. Survival was a matter of reflexes, luck, and psychological resistance. In the end, those who remained alive related something essential: that firing did not feel like a heroic act of defense, but like a prolonged sentence. One remembered dazed how the explosions enveloped him and how each shrapnel cut through the air and muscles, and that only at the end did he understand that the cannon had stopped firing not by order, but because there were no longer hands left to reload it. Thus it was that in those fateful years the German Flak became the epicenter of a desperate defense. Masses of steel and lead raised in a city upon which fire fell from the sky. A fire that demanded lives as its price, and that made clear that to defend the air meant to give up the ground. An anti-aircraft gunner on the Russian front. The Flak soldier on the Eastern Front lived an existence marked by the constant noise of steel, the cutting cold of the steppes, and the certainty that each day could be the last. He was not a combatant hidden behind deep trenches, nor a crew member sheltered in armor. He was a man exposed, standing beside a cannon, turned into a priority target for the Soviets from the moment the flash of his piece lit up the plain. The days began before dawn. The ground was hard, often covered with snow or with mud that soaked the boots until they were useless. The men awoke wrapped in damp blankets, under improvised roofs of canvas or branches. The first ritual was to light a small fire, if conditions allowed, to warm watery coffee or thin soup. Then the inspection of the cannon, cleaning the bore, greasing the elevation mechanisms, verifying the aim. The 88mm, heavy and majestic, was at once pride and condemnation. With it, they could bring down a bomber or pierce a T-34, but they also knew that its silhouette was too visible and that the Soviets hunted it with rage. A gunner wrote that what he most feared was not the direct clash with the tanks, but the silence that preceded the Soviet air attacks. Hearing the growing roar of engines, without knowing from which direction they would come, was psychological torture. When the Il-2 descended in dives, the Flak positions were the first to be attacked. A burst of rockets or machine guns could destroy the crew in seconds. Many fell without even having fired once. The survivors rose among smoke and blood, dragged the wounded aside, and returned to loading shells. The routine was relentless. During the great battles of 1941 in the surroundings of Smolensk, several batteries were placed directly in the open fields. The men described how they spent entire hours under artillery fire, covering themselves barely behind parapets of snow and frozen earth. A testimony recounted that, after a day of bombardments, of the 12 men of his crew, only 4 remained standing. The others had been hit by fragments of shrapnel, lay dismembered around the piece, which continued functioning among pools of frozen blood. That night, the survivors gathered the bodies and dug a common grave under the starry sky with hardened hands and tears mixed with the smoke of gunpowder. The Russian winter imposed another enemy, the cold. The cannons froze, the mechanisms jammed, the shells were covered in frost. The men had to warm the pieces with improvised braziers, exposing themselves to being discovered by the glow. One remembered that when loading a metallic shell with bare hands, it stuck to his skin because of the ice, tearing pieces of flesh. The soaked boots ended up turning into rigid blocks, and the night watches became endless, with snow falling ceaselessly on the faces of boys barely past 20 years. When the Soviet tanks arrived, the tension became unbearable. The order was to maintain fire until the enemy was close enough to ensure penetration. Each shot was a roar that shook the chest and filled the air with dust. Some T-34s burned wrapped in flames, but others kept advancing, firing shots that blew the gunners' parapets to pieces. There were occasions when the armored vehicles crossed the positions and passed over the cannons, crushing men and pieces in the same brutal act. A survivor recounted that when a tank stopped a few meters from his battery, he could see the face of the Soviet commander leaning out of the turret, shouting orders seconds before the 88 hit him full on. The emotional life was just as ruthless. Letters from home were a vital relief, more important than the daily ration. When they arrived, the men gathered around the comrade who read, sharing the words as if they were food. One described how, after receiving a letter from his mother, he felt for an instant transported to the family table with the smell of freshly baked bread. But that mirage vanished quickly. It was enough for the radar to detect enemy air movement for everything to return to noise and death. The fear of sudden death mixed with a silent resignation. Many Flak soldiers knew that their life expectancy was short. In the forward positions, it was whispered that no one survived more than a few months serving on cannons. It was common for a replacement to arrive at a battery, and in less than a week, fall struck down by shrapnel. Sometimes the survivors did not even remember their names. "We were a shadow that faded quickly," wrote one of them. On calm days, if such a thing existed, the men clung to small rituals, smoking a shared cigarette, singing softly, playing a game of cards with a worn deck. Some wrote brief diaries with broken sentences that spoke more of exhaustion than of battles. "Today none of ours fell, that is enough," noted a gunner in the autumn of 1942. Another wrote, "The sky has become our enemy. Each cloud seems to hide a plane that comes to kill us." The smell was an inseparable part of daily life. Gunpowder, machinery oil, rancid sweat, and burned bodies. The men ended up impregnated with those aromas which could no longer be washed away with cold water. In the end, death became a daily companion. Corpses of comrades dragged to one side, blackened bodies beside the cannons, stains of frozen blood in the snow. The Flak soldier in Russia lived surrounded by that vision, with the certainty that tomorrow it could be him who remained in that position, motionless forever. In Stalingrad, the anti-aircraft batteries served as siege cannons against buildings occupied by Soviets. The gunners fired against the ruins knowing that at any moment they could be flanked. One of them described how after hours of combat his piece was hit by mortar fire. Of 8 men in the crew, only 2 remained alive. When night fell, they crawled through ruins until they found another battery, where they continued serving as if nothing had happened. There was no ceremony for the fallen, only a quick farewell under the rubble. The Flak soldier on the Russian front was not a spectator of the air war, nor a mere auxiliary. He was a combatant condemned to fight in 2 directions, toward the sky against planes that devastated his positions, and toward the earth against tanks that seemed endless. His life was a routine of inhuman physical work, constant fear, unbearable cold, and nearby death. It was also a life of fleeting camaraderie in which each face could disappear in a matter of hours. In the memoirs and letters that survived, there is a constant, the feeling of having been forgotten by everyone, even by their own army. "We are meat for the cannons and nothing more," wrote one in 1943. And yet they remained at their posts, loading shells under the snow, firing at the sky blackened by columns of smoke, resisting until the body or luck told them enough. Such was the life of those men, brief, brutal, and marked by the echo of the 88's shots, which thundered in the Russian steppe like a heartbeat of steel destined to fade too soon. The young flak helper. Starting in 1943, when the war began to turn against Germany and the losses on the Eastern Front proved impossible to replace, the Luftwaffe made a decision that would seal the fate of an entire generation to mobilize teenagers from secondary schools and universities as auxiliaries of the anti-aircraft artillery. These boys, known as Flak helper, were between 15 and 17 years old. They had barely left childhood games behind when they found themselves pushed to serve in urban batteries that would become the most punished targets of the entire air war. The uniform they received was too large. The helmets fell over their foreheads, and the boots, often recycled from dead soldiers, were uncomfortable. Some could barely carry the 20mm shells of the light pieces, much less those of an 88mm that weighed 9 kilos. Their training was scarce, a few weeks of basic instruction, test shots, and short marches before being assigned to a flak tower or to an emplacement on the outskirts of Hamburg, Berlin, or the Ruhr. From the first day, the routine was ruthless. The service began with long hours of vigilance, binoculars in hand, scanning the sky in search of enemy formations. The searchlights, which many of them also operated, swept the nights trying to trap in their silver beams the silhouette of a bomber. When the air raid alarm sounded, fear turned into adrenaline. The order was clear: load, aim, and fire without rest until the skies were empty. The reality was that they rarely managed to bring down planes. The most common thing was to see a storm of bombs fall on them that pulverized the ground and swept away entire positions. The accounts of these youths speak of the sudden loss of innocence. One of them wrote in his diary that after the first raid, he stopped feeling like a boy and understood that his life had ceased to be normal. Another described the moment when he saw his best friend die, torn away by an explosion a few meters from the piece. He found him hours later among the rubble, unrecognizable, and from then on he could never smile again without feeling a knot in his stomach. The life of the flak helper was a swing between the classroom and hell. In the morning they could attend reduced classes where the teachers, many of them veterans of the Great War, spoke with resignation about the homeland and sacrifice. In the afternoon they were in the defense towers, with fingers numbed by the cold, firing against formations of B-17 and Lancasters that roared over their heads. The irony was that they were still students and at the same time soldiers. They still carried notebooks in their backpacks, but the sound that dominated their lives was the crash of the cannons. The flak towers of Berlin and Hamburg were concrete fortresses that offered some protection, but most of the youths served in positions in the open air, on rooftops, vacant lots, or parks. There, with no more defense than sandbags, they were easy prey for enemy fire. The rocket attacks of the P-47 and Typhoon fighter bombers were particularly deadly. The shrapnel pierced adolescent bodies with the same ease as wooden structures. The psychological impact was devastating. Many of these youths at the end of the war dragged nightmares for decades. They woke up with the imaginary sound of sirens, saw in dreams the faces of comrades disfigured by shrapnel, or felt again the pressure of the air when a bomb fell too close. Some confessed years later that they were never able to adapt to civilian life. They had become adults too soon, marked by the massive death lived in the middle of adolescence. However, among them also arose a strange comradeship. They supported each other, shared scarce rations, exchanged letters from home, sang songs to keep up morale. That youthful fraternity was the only net that sustained them in the face of an environment that had abandoned them to their fate. The Luftwaffe officers, aware of their short age, sometimes showed a forced paternalism, but the reality was that each flak helper knew that he was as much a target of the enemy as any veteran. The statistics reflect the price they paid. In some cities, more than 60% of the flak helper did not survive the last 2 years of the war. Those who did were marked physically or emotionally. Those who returned to the classrooms after 1945 found that they could no longer concentrate on lessons or tasks. They had seen too much, they had lost friends, they had heard laughter turn into screams. The story of these youths is one of the most tragic of the war. Teenagers torn from their childhood, thrown into a desperate defense against the deadliest sky in Europe. Their lives were consumed between explosions, smoke, and fear, turned into human pieces of a gear that sought to resist the inevitable. The pit of the cannon, the office of the anti-aircraft soldier. The life of a flak soldier was marked by a mixture of exhausting routine, constant fear, and brutal exposure to death. Unlike the infantry, which could retreat, or the tank crews, who at least had armor, the anti-aircraft gunners fought outdoors, nailed to their cannons. The day began long before dawn. Most slept in improvised barracks next to the piece or, in the cities, in basements near the positions. At 4 or 5 in the morning, they were already on their feet, cleaning the cannons, greasing mechanisms, verifying sights, calibrating aiming instruments. The service was almost continuous. During daylight hours, they trained or remained on alert, and during the night they rotated between vigilance, reloading and aiming. The soldier lived with his eyes fixed on the sky, attentive to the distant hum of engines that could mean death. The physical work was exhausting. A shell of 88 millimeters weighed more than 9 kilos. Each crew had to move hundreds of them per day. The young auxiliaries, many barely 16 or 17 years old, spent the day transporting boxes, loading shells and leaving them ready next to the cannon. The recoil of the piece shook the entire body. The vibrations left ringing in the ears for hours. The gunpowder impregnated the clothes, and the metallic smell of burned shrapnel mixed with sweat and dust. The flak soldier lived under 2 different fears, that of the bombings and that of being a priority target. Each flash revealed the position to enemy pilots. It was known that, after each salvo, a bomb could fall directed at the battery. For that reason, many learned to live with constant tension, with the sensation that each shot could be the last. There were no real shelters. Most of the urban emplacements were in vacant lots, squares, or rooftops. Only a few had concrete parapets. The days of combat were a prolonged hell. In the middle of a raid, the sky was covered with black clouds of explosions. The order was to fire without ceasing, to saturate the air, to force the bombers to disperse. The gunner barely saw more than flashes and shadows crossing at high altitude, but kept pressing the trigger, trusting that some shrapnel would reach its target. When a bomber fell, the jubilation lasted seconds. Immediately more waves arrived and the bombs fell on them. Rest was scarce and precarious. Many slept on cots next to the piece, wrapped in blankets full of grease with boots on, ready to jump in seconds. Food arrived irregularly, watery soups, black bread, cans. Cold and humidity were constant enemies. Gloves burned when touching the hot metal after several shots. And in winter, the ice stuck the skin to the pieces if one was not careful. Emotional life was equally hard. Letters from home were vital relief. The soldiers awaited the mail distribution as if it were ammunition. In the midst of noise and smoke, reading a few lines from mother or girlfriend could restore strength for another endless night. But news of fallen comrades was also frequent. In each battery, replacements were continuous and faces changed quickly. It was rare for a crew to remain intact for more than a few months. On the Eastern Front, the life of the flak was even harder. There, they not only aimed at the sky, they also faced Soviet tanks. They spent hours digging positions in open fields, camouflaging cannons among trees, knowing that at any moment they could be overrun by armored vehicles or destroyed by artillery. Some recounted the panic of seeing a column of T-34 approaching, while they, exposed, tried to fire before being hit. A flak soldier lived with the certainty that death was closer than for others. Each day was a succession of mechanical tasks, fear of distant engines, shouted orders, explosions, and fatigue. Sometimes, in the few moments of calm, they shared a cigarette or a piece of hard bread, laughed briefly, remembered home. Then, the wail of sirens or the roar of the sky returned them to reality. Load, aim, fire. In sum, the life of a German anti-aircraft gunner was the life of a condemned man in the open air, working without cease at his cannon, awaiting attacks without shelter, suffering hunger, cold, and fear, and accepting that his survival was, more than a merit, an improbable coincidence in the middle of the storm. Flak under Soviet fire. On the Eastern Front, the gunners of the flak soon discovered that their enemy was not only the sky. The same cannon that was supposed to fire against bombers had to be turned toward the ground to face columns of Soviet tanks and infantry assaults. That dual role made their positions inevitable targets, always in sight, always fixed, always prioritized by enemy artillery. The result was that many batteries were trapped in land battles that tore them apart to the last man. An account from 1941 describes an 88mm battery placed in open ground during the initial offensive towards Smolensk. The men dug shallow trenches around the piece, confident that they could hold the ground. At dawn, they heard the roar of Soviet engines. A column of T-34s advanced directly toward them. The shells began to fly, striking and destroying the vanguard tanks, but each shot of the German cannon revealed the position. In minutes, the Soviet artillery responded with a deluge of grenades that ripped up earth, men, and shrapnel alike. Of 12 gunners, only 5 remained alive at the end of the day, and one of them later recounted that he never again slept without hearing the echo of those engines approaching at full speed. In the winter of 1942, in the surroundings of Rzhev, another crew faced an even more desperate situation. The frozen terrain did not allow deep positions to be dug, so the cannons remained exposed over the snow. During a night attack, Soviet infantry managed to infiltrate between the lines and assaulted the battery directly. The gunners, without enough rifles, wielded pistols, knives, even loading levers. Some died defending the piece with blows, as if the cannon were a living comrade that should not fall into enemy hands. At dawn, the survivors were found embraced to the frozen steel of the 88, dead by bayonets and hand grenades. At Kursk, in the summer of 1943, the use of the Flak as anti-tank artillery reached massive proportions. The German defensive lines were dotted with 88, 105 and 128 mm cannons, arranged to stop the Soviet armored offensive. The scenes left by those combats were infernal, entire batteries firing without pause against waves of tanks, managing to destroy dozens of them, but being crushed after hours by the weight of numbers. An officer wrote that the gunners of the Flak fought until their cannons turned red from fire, and when there was no more ammunition, they fought with their bare hands until being exterminated. The word exterminated was not an exaggeration. In some sectors, the casualty rate exceeded 90%. Later, in 1944, when the Soviet offensive pushed into Belarus and Poland, the situation repeated itself. In villages and crossroads, the Flak batteries were the last obstacle between the Soviet tanks and the German rearguard. There, the gunners were deliberately left behind, with orders to resist until the last shell. Most obeyed that order to the letter. When the tanks burst into the positions, they found cannons still smoking, surrounded by corpses. In some cases, the Soviets captured intact pieces, but never their servers. The gunners preferred to die beside the cannon rather than surrender it. The suffering was not limited to direct combat. Each Soviet attack brought with it hours of saturation fire. The enemy artillery bombarded without rest the Flak positions before launching the tanks. The men remained crouched in shallow holes, with the earth shaking around them, their ears bursting from the explosions. The stress was unbearable. Some came out with bleeding hands from gripping their rifles too tightly. Others remained paralyzed, unable to react when the order to open fire came. Those who survived those bombardments emerged with vacant stares, aged in a matter of hours. The testimonies agree that the most terrifying sight was to see the T-34s or KV-1 advancing while their cannons opened fire. For a Flak gunner, that meant being trapped in a nightmare, having to load and fire with precision, knowing that any mistake would cost him his life. Many recounted how their hands went numb with fear, how the shells slipped from them before being placed in the chamber. And yet they fired. They fired because behind them there was no one else, because they were the last line. The result was a level of physical and psychological wear almost impossible to describe. Those who survived those encounters were marked for life. Deafness, tremors, insomnia, memories of comrades torn apart beside them. For many, the war ended long before 1945. Although they remained at their posts, they were no longer complete men, but exhausted shadows that mechanically repeated the gestures of loading, aiming, and firing. Such was the life of the Flak under Soviet fire, a war on two fronts, against the sky and against the earth, in which the gunners had no possible refuge. A desperate struggle in which they stood firm, knowing that their positions were doomed, and that the only thing they could decide was whether they would die firing or die waiting. Flak over the cities in 1944 to 1945. In the last 2 years of the war, the German cities were transformed into open-air fortresses. Berlin, Hamburg, Essen, Cologne, Munich. All were surrounded by belts of anti-aircraft batteries, and in their squares, parks, and rooftops, cannons of all calibers were raised. The Flak, which had been born as a technical weapon, became a symbol. For the civilian population, those cannons were the last promise of defense against the masses of steel that filled the skies. For their crews, they were graves waiting to be closed. The Allied air raids had reached unimaginable magnitude. Thousands of bombers could fly over the Reich in a single day. In 1944, when the combined Anglo-American offensive began, each industrial city was attacked systematically, with a precision and density of fire that annulled any illusion of prolonged resistance. Nevertheless, the orders were clear: fire until the last shell, maintain civilian morale, demonstrate that the Luftwaffe was still alive even if it could barely respond in the skies. The flak towers of Berlin and Hamburg were cyclopean fortresses of concrete. There, the crews felt relatively safe, protected by walls several meters thick. But most of the gunners did not serve in those constructions. Their pieces were placed in open spaces, urban squares, rooftops reinforced with beams and sandbags. From there, they fought in the open air, firing against formations of B-17 and Lancasters that crossed the sky in endless waves. Each flash of their cannons was answered with fragmentation bombs that turned the position into a hell. The testimonies gathered in diaries and letters are a mosaic of suffering. A 17-year-old youth, recruited as a Flakhelfer, wrote that in a single night of attack he lost 6 of his comrades struck by shrapnel while serving ammunition. Another recounted how, seeking shelter after a bombing, he found a comrade still clinging to the aiming wheel, dead standing, with his gaze fixed on the darkened sky. The scenes were so frequent that they ceased to cause surprise. Each position knew that half of its men could disappear in an instant. The physical wear was unbearable. During the great attacks, the cannons fired without pause for hours. The recoil battered the shoulders and backs of the servers, the hands filled with blisters from handling burning shells, the ears destroyed by the constant roar. At the end of a raid, the men collapsed exhausted among the empty casings covered in soot and dust. But the rest was brief. Soon new alarms sounded, and they had to return to the piece, with empty stomachs and trembling muscles. The psychological pressure was even more devastating. Inside the cities, each shot was accompanied by the crash of buildings collapsing, of civilians screaming among ruins, of children crying in dark basements. The gunners knew that no matter how much they fired, the destruction did not stop. That sense of impotence undermined morale. Nevertheless, the propaganda portrayed them as heroes, guardians of the homeland. That contradiction, feeling condemned and at the same time presented as symbols of resistance, weighed on their consciences. Many wrote that they continued fighting only not to abandon their comrades or the families taking refuge beneath them. Life in the bombed cities also meant living with civilian death. The gunners saw bombs fall on hospitals, churches, and schools. After the combat, they were often ordered to help in rescue tasks, removing bodies from the rubble, carrying wounded, extinguishing fires. The contrast was brutal. A few hours before they fired at the sky, and afterward they dug through ruins to remove the corpses of children. That routine broke even the hardest. In Berlin, toward April of 1945, the flak batteries became field artillery pieces to stop the Soviet advance. What once pointed to the sky was turned against the avenues through which tanks and infantry columns burst in. The gunners, exhausted after years of bombings, were forced to fight in street battles, firing against occupied buildings or against armored vehicles approaching a few meters away. The struggle was desperate. Surrounded cannons, destroyed positions, decimated crews. Many of those youths who had begun serving against planes ended up dying facing T-34s at point-blank range. The final figures are eloquent. By 1945, it was estimated that 80% of the flak crews had died or been seriously wounded. The defense of the cities was, in reality, a massive sacrifice of men and boys who served until the end without any real hope of victory. Their lives were consumed in the roar of the cannons, under skies blackened by smoke and fire. For the civilian population, those gunners were a sign of resistance. For themselves, they were victims of an inexorable condemnation. Their routine was not glorious heroism, but exhaustion, fear, and repeated death again and again. The cities of the Reich became open mausoleums, where each flak battery was at once trench and grave. The Volkssturm and the Flak in the final days. When the war approached the heart of the Reich, the flak cannons were no longer manned by veterans hardened by years of bombings. Around them began to appear men with faces marked by old age, Boys barely out of school, employees torn from offices, and peasants who had never seen an 88mm shell. They were the Volkssturm, the militia created by decree in September of 1944 and thrown in the following months into a war they could neither understand nor withstand. There, among concrete towers and devastated squares, they shared the anti-aircraft pieces with the last gunners of the Luftwaffe. The scene was repeated in Berlin, Königsberg, Breslau, or Vienna. A cannon emplaced in the middle of the ruins, surrounded by youths with white armbands and old men who breathed with difficulty. Trying to understand the orders shouted by an exhausted non-commissioned officer, the Flak had been transformed into a place of initiation and sacrifice. The shells weighed more than their inexperienced arms could lift, and the recoil of the cannon threw them to the ground. Nevertheless, the impossible was expected of them, to stop both the Allied bombers and the Soviet tanks. For many, it was an immediate baptism of fire. They had barely received a few hours of instruction on how to handle a shell or how to turn the aiming crank. The rest they learned under the bombs. In Berlin, adolescents of the Hitler Youth who 2 weeks earlier had distributed pamphlets were sent to gigantic flak towers, where they were stunned by the thunder of double 128mm pieces. Old men who had fought in 1918 clung to the steering wheel with arthritic hands, trying to follow a sky furrowed by bombers that seemed to multiply. The psychological shock was brutal. The propaganda had promised an uprising of the people, a heroic defense in which each German would transform into a soldier. The reality was another. Disoriented men dragged into a war machine that was already broken. The professional gunners looked at them with a mixture of compassion and resignation, knowing that within days they would be corpses. In some cases, the instructors did not even try to teach them much. Just load when you are ordered, just fire where you are pointed. The war in its final stage did not allow for more. On the Eastern Front, the convergence between Volkssturm and Flak was even more dramatic. As the Soviets advanced, the batteries that defended the cities became ground artillery posts. There, the militiamen were thrown against the T-34, without experience, without discipline, and many times without will. The accounts speak of old men who refused to let go of the cannon even when there was no ammunition left, of youths who fled in terror upon seeing the tanks approaching, and of some who, in a fit of fanaticism or despair, fired until they were overrun. In Berlin, April of 1945, the fusion between the Flak and the Volkssturm reached its paroxysm. The gigantic towers resisted like fortresses, but in the streets, in courtyards and in parks, the smaller cannons were served by improvised battalions of neighbors armed by force. Their students mixed with railway workers, school teachers with bakers, all with an armband that turned them into soldiers without preparation. The result was predictable, extremely high casualties in a matter of hours. 80% of the Flak crews had already fallen throughout the war. Now the replacements died even faster because they lacked the minimum training to survive under crossfire. The physical suffering was evident. Many did not have adequate uniforms, fought in civilian clothes under an old coat, carrying shells of 9 or 10 kilos that tore their muscles. The recoil of the cannon stunned them, the smoke blinded them, the thunder destroyed their eardrums. Several fainted not from wounds but from exhaustion. The Luftwaffe veterans forced them to continue, shook them so they would load again because each second could mean the difference between stopping a tank or being crushed. The moral panorama was even worse. Some militiamen entered combat convinced by propaganda that they were fighting to save their families. Others went dragged without conviction, knowing they would not return. The diversity of attitudes generated tensions. While some fought with blind fury, others hid in basements or surrendered as soon as they had the chance. The Flak officers tried to maintain discipline with threats, sometimes with pistol in hand. There were summary executions of deserters, even of 15-year-old boys. The later testimonies coincide in the feeling of absurdity. A Volkssturmmann recounted that when he saw a 14-year-old boy fall at his side, his body destroyed by shrapnel, he understood that that defense was not heroic, but a useless sacrifice. Another wrote that after firing a few rounds, he remained paralyzed looking at the red sky of Berlin and understood that he was witnessing not only the defeat of Germany, but the destruction of an entire generation. The forced union of Flak and Volkssturm symbolized the end of the Third Reich. The cannons that had defended the sky for years became the last trenches of an exhausted population. The old and the children who served them died en masse, not as experienced soldiers, but as victims dragged onto the battlefield in a collective sacrifice. In those final days, the war was reduced to a grotesque spectacle. Artillery pieces handled by incapable bodies, orders shouted at men who could barely hear, shots that did not change the inevitable destiny. The result was the same everywhere: positions devastated, crews annihilated, cities turned into ruins. The Volkssturm and the Flak were, in the last days, the purest expression of desperation, an improvised army that manned weapons impossible to handle, a defense sustained with corpses, a sacrifice that could not save anything.